used to think the fog in Oregon was just a weather pattern until I saw something walking on the water that didn't have a reflection. I'm not a person who scares easily. I spent 6 years in the private security sector, mostly doing monotonous graveyard shifts at warehouses and construction sites. When I landed the job at the Coos Bay Shipyard, I thought I had it made. It paid $25 an hour just to sit in a heated shack, drink coffee, and watch a bank of monitors. The shipyard was massive, a graveyard of rusted hulls and towering gantry cranes that looked like skeletal giants in the moonlight. My only real responsibility was to make sure no local kids broke in to spray paint the equipment and to ensure no one was borrowing copper wire. It was a Tuesday in late November, the kind of night where the air feels heavy and damp enough to soak through your jacket in minutes. A thick pea soup fog had rolled in from the Pacific, swallowing the docks entirely. By 1 a.m., I couldn't see the end of the pier from my window. It was just me, the hum of the space heater, and the flickering glow of 8 black and white security monitors around 2:15 a.m. I noticed something odd on Camera 4. Camera 4 was positioned on the edge of the north dock, facing the open water of the inlet. Usually it showed nothing but blackness and the occasional rhythmic bobbing of a buoy. But tonight, the thermal overlay was acting up. On a thermal camera, anything with heat shows up as a bright white or yellow shape against a dark background. I saw a pinpoint of white out on the water. At first, I thought it was a seal, or maybe a stray kayak. But it wasn't bobbing. It was moving at a steady, rhythmic pace, and it was getting larger. I leaned in, squinting at the grainy screen. The heat signature wasn't just a blob. As it got closer to the dock, it began to take a vertical shape. It looked like a person, but that was impossible. There was no boat, no pier out that far, just 50 feet of freezing, deep water channel. I toggled to the high contrast filter. The shape was now clearly a humanoid figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall. If it was standing on the bottom of the channel, it would have to be 30 feet high, but it wasn't submerged. The heat signature was entirely above the water's surface. It looked like it was simply walking. I felt a cold prickle start at the base of my neck and crawl down my spine. I told myself it was a glitch. High-end thermal tech can sometimes ghost images if the sensors are cold, mirroring a heat source from elsewhere. I checked the other cameras, nothing, just the empty shipyard and the rolling fog. I looked back at Camera 4. The figure was now only 20 yards from the edge of the dock. It stopped. Even through the low-resolution feed, I could see it turn. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, elongated head that sat directly on broad, hunched shoulders. It stood there for a full minute, perfectly still, looking directly into the camera lens. I felt a sudden, irrational surge of panic, like a prey animal realizing it's been spotted. Suddenly, the monitor for Camera 4 went to static. I sat there in the silence of the shack, my heart hammering against my ribs. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence. A cable had snapped, or the fog had finally shorted the housing. I reached for my radio to call the site supervisor, but then I remembered. I was the only one on site until the 6 a.m. shift change. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and my mag light. I didn't want to go out there. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to lock the door and wait for the sun. But if there was an intruder and I didn't report it, I'd be fired by morning. I stepped out of the shack. The fog was even thicker than it looked from inside. It felt like walking through wet wool. My flashlight beam only cut about 5 feet ahead of me before hitting a wall of white. I started walking toward the north dock. my boots echoing off the damp pavement. Clang. I froze. It was the sound of metal striking metal. It came from the direction of the cranes. "Security, who's there?" I shouted. My voice sounded thin and fragile in the vast open space. No answer. Only the sound of the water lapping against the pilings. I reached the edge of the dock where Camera 4 was mounted. I shone my light down at the water. It was black and oily, reflecting nothing but right at the edge of the concrete pier. There were wet footprints, not normal footprints. These were massive, the size of a man's torso, and they weren't shaped like boots. They looked like elongated three-toed impressions pressed deep into the grime of the dock. And they were leading away from the water, toward the cranes, toward me. I swung my light toward the base of the nearest gantry crane. The beam hit something, a leg. It was pale, the color of a fish's belly, and covered in a thin, translucent film that shimmered in the light. It was as thick as a tree trunk. I tilted the flashlight up and up and up. The fog walker was crouched behind the crane's massive iron supports. It was folded in on itself like a colossal insect, its long, spindly limbs tucked against its chest. Even crouched, it was twice my height. It had no eyes, just two dark, recessed pits where eyes should be, and a mouth that was nothing more than a jagged horizontal slit. It wasn't moving, it was just watching me. I didn't scream, I couldn't. My lungs felt like they had turned to lead. We stayed like that for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 seconds. The thing began to unfurl. It moved with a sickening fluid grace, its joints popping like dry wood snapping in a fire. As it rose to its full height, it let out a sound I will never forget. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was a perfect digital mimicry of the shipyard's own foghorn, but played at a frequency that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I dropped my flashlight. I didn't pick it up. I turned and ran. I didn't run back to the shack. I ran for the main gate. I didn't care about my car. I didn't care about my phone. I just ran until my shins burned and my breath came in ragged gasps. I scrambled over the chain link fence, tearing my jacket and gashing my arm, and I didn't stop until I reached the main highway a mile away. I stood under the flickering light of a street lamp, shivering and bleeding, until a long-haul trucker pulled over to help me. He asked if I'd been in a wreck. I couldn't even answer him. I just stared back at the shipyard, where the fog was glowing with a faint, rhythmic white light. I never went back for my stuff. I mailed my keys to the office with a note saying I was resigning, effective immediately due to a family emergency. They tried to call me for a week, probably wanting to know why Camera 4 was smashed to pieces and why there were unidentified organic residues all over the North Dock. I blocked their number. I moved to the desert shortly after that. People ask me why I live in a place so dry and dusty. I just tell them I like the clarity. In the desert, you can see what's coming for miles, and most importantly, there's never any fog. I've driven across the Mojave a dozen times, but I never knew that silence could actually sound like a warning. It was nearly 3 a.m. I was halfway through a solo haul from Vegas to Reno, driving a route that most people avoid after the sun goes down. My fuel light had been glowing a steady, taunting orange for the last 20 miles when I finally saw it. A lone, shimmering oasis of neon and rusted metal. It was a no-name station, the kind that looks like it hasn't been updated since the 70s. I pulled in, the gravel crunching loudly under my tires. the only sound for miles. The air out there was different. It wasn't just hot, it was still, dead still. I stepped out to start the pump. The smell of gasoline and sagebrush was overwhelming. I looked toward the small glass-fronted shop. Inside, a single attendant sat behind a plexiglass barrier. He looked old. His skin was like cured leather, and his eyes were wide, darting toward my car and then back to something behind the building. I walked toward the shop to buy a bottle of water and maybe some caffeine to get me through the final stretch. As I pushed the door open, a small bell chimed, sounding unnervingly loud in the quiet. The attendant didn't look at my face. He looked at my feet, then at my shadow on the floor. He was trembling. His hands were flat on the counter, and I could see his knuckles were white. "Just the water," I said, placing a $5 bill on the counter. He didn't reach for the money. Instead, he slowly raised a shaking hand and pointed to a laminated sign taped to the glass. It was a standard no loitering sign, but he wasn't pointing at the text. His finger was tapping rhythmically on the image of a security camera icon at the bottom. Then, his lips started moving. No sound came out. He was mouthing something over and over. "Don't look behind. You." My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. I didn't turn around. I could feel the heat of the desert night pressing against the glass door behind me. I looked at the small, convex security mirror mounted in the corner of the ceiling. In the distorted reflection, I could see the front of my car at the pump, and standing just inches behind my rear bumper was a figure. It was a man, or at least it had the... He was perfectly still. He wasn't looking at the shop. He was staring at the back of my head through the rear window of my car. "That'll be $4. The attendant suddenly barked, his voice cracking. He was trying to sound normal, but his eyes were screaming. "Keep the change," I whispered. The footsteps outside weren't moving toward the door. They were circling my car. I watched the mirror. The figure in the coat was dragging a long, thin object behind him in the dirt. It looked like a rusted piece of rebar, or maybe a very long blade. The attendant leaned in close to the plexiglass, his breath fogging the surface. "He's been waiting for a car with out-of-state plates," he whispered so low I could barely hear him. "He doesn't want the money. He wants the ride. If you go out there, don't unlock the passenger side, no matter what he says, no matter what he sounds like." I felt a surge of pure, cold terror. I had to get back to the car. If I stayed in the shop, I was trapped. If I went out there, I was vulnerable. I took a breath, gripped my keys in my pocket until the metal bit into my palm, and pushed the door open. The heat hit me like a physical wall. I walked toward the driver's side, keeping my eyes fixed on the door handle. I could see the man in the periphery of my vision. He was standing by the rear passenger door now. He wasn't moving. He didn't have a face, just a mass of gray, tattered fabric wrapped around his head like a bandage. I hit the unlock button on my fob, but only for the driver's door. I dove inside and slammed it shut. Punching the manual lock immediately, I fumbled the key into the ignition. The engine turned over, coughed, and died. Come on," I hissed, sweat stinging my eyes. A tap came on the passenger window. Tink, tink, tink. It was the sound of a wedding ring hitting the glass. I looked over. The figure was standing right there. The gray fabric was inches from the window, and then it spoke. But it didn't use its own voice. It used mine. "Hey, I think I left my phone in the back seat," the figure said. It was my voice, my exact pitch. the same way I'd spoken to the attendant moments ago. "Can you let me in? It's really hot out here." The engine roared to life on the second try. I didn't wait to see more. I slammed the car into gear and floored it, the tires screaming as they grabbed the asphalt. I didn't look in the rearview mirror until I was a mile down the road. When I finally did, I saw the gas station's lights flickering in the distance. The figure was standing in the middle of the highway, perfectly still, holding that long metal rod. I drove until the sun came up. I didn't stop for coffee. I didn't stop for a bathroom break. When I finally reached Reno, I went straight to a car wash. I didn't want the desert dust on my car anymore. While the brushes were scrubbing the exterior, I looked at the passenger side window. There, in the thin layer of grime and dust, was a single, perfect handprint. But the fingers were too long, way too long, and there were 6 of them. I sold that car the following week, and now I only drive during the day, and if my tank ever gets below half, I pull over at the biggest, brightest station I can find. The kind with lots of people and no shadows, because I know that out there in the dark there's something that knows exactly what I sound like, and it's still waiting for a ride.